Computer. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And on today's program, we're rejoined by returning champion Tyler Shipley. Tyler is a historian, as always, with a critical left perspective, part of Canada's truth-telling and myth-busting movement. And he is a historian, but his official title is Professor of Culture, Society, and Commerce at the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Humber College Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning. Damn, what a title. And of course, Tyler is the author of Ottawa and Empire, Canada and the Military Coup in Honduras, Canada in the World, Settler Capitalism and the Colonial Imagination. And on this program, we're going to be talking about the right wing. We're going to be talking about the debates that's been going on the left on whether we can ever make alliances with the right and so forth, and hopefully talk about other stuff. But before we get into that, Tyler, Tyler, thanks so much for coming back on the program.
Thanks for having me, Youri. Good to be back.
Always an honor to have you. And so, yeah, Tyler, let's get into it, because this was a subject I wanted to explore with you the last time, but because I try to sometimes make sure that our interviews are very focused. So we had a very good conversation about Canada and World War II and so forth. But we were talking last time on the program very briefly about the far right and how and the world is shifting more and more towards the right, and even people who are very great on some issues. It could be anti-imperialism issues. It could, they could claim that they're very socially liberal and stuff like that. But then on other issues, they pivot very hard towards the right and so forth like that. And there's been, I don't want to open up, the can of worms, but of course there was a huge debate that happened with our, American brothers and sisters. There was, a big, massive mobilization against the war in Ukraine. Rage Against the War Machine. There were some, left-leaning folks, like my friend David Swanson of World Beyond War, Dr. Jill Stein of the Green Party, Jimmy Dore, Max Blumenthal, and folks like that. But it was very much largely a libertarian, mobilization against, particularly, the war in Ukraine, which I do applaud. I applaud anyone that can stick their neck out against that war, which is one of the most propagated wars, and it's one of those wars where even if you have a history of being anti-war, you speak out against that, and you speak out against the pivot to Asia, be prepared. You're going to get a lot of shit for it. But there was a debate then that happened amongst the black left and others that the left, the Western left, or the mostly white left, white socialists, white Marxists, go too much out of their way to how can I say that they go too much out of their way to reach out to people who are far right, whether they're fiscally conservative and socially regressive. Again, fiscally conservative and socially regressive. And I know members of Black Alliance for Peace, Jacqueline Luqman of Black Power Media, and who sometimes also writes articles for Black Agenda Reports, Jared Ball, whom I consider a comrade and a friend who's been on the program 3 times now. They've spoken out on how they always see this trend where white socialists, white Marxists, either complain nonstop about identity politics, which for us people of color or people of a feminist background and of a queer background, that we usually see that as code for, I don't want to talk about white supremacy, I don't want to talk about the patriarchy, and don't you dare bring up heteronormativity. So sometimes we see, sometimes I notice that even amongst the best of the left, which yes is largely white, often male dominated, when I hear those white socialists, white Marxists complain about identity politics, and they do complain very bitterly about identity politics. It does feel a lot of times, and in fact, in practice, it really is just their way of saying that I don't want to talk about white supremacy, patriarchy, and of course heteronormativity and so forth. And then we saw the Brexit referendum. That was a very toxic. That was a very awful thing that happens. Living in Belgium, we're right next door to Britain, and we get we get access to the BBC and to some of the British media, whether it's The Economist, The Guardian, and of course Murdoch's far right stuff and the Daily Mail. And it was very obvious, even if you weren't, even if you didn't know too much about the ins and outs of the EU and what the debate was, but it was very obvious that the far right was that the right was attacking the European Union for being too liberal, for being too left, for dumping immigrants on England, and you had folks on the left who would say things like the European Union colonizes us, and that and you did have members of the left who actually would go to rallies with people like Nigel Farage, grotesque right-wing dingbats like Boris Johnson and so forth, to say that we want our country back, and basically literally making alliances with the right and yes, some on the left would attack the EU from the left, but many of them basically kind of shifted to the right. And when Jeremy Corbyn, when he was rejected by the electorate because he wanted a second, he was pressured to say that we want a second referendum with the European Union. And for me, it just seems as if when you look at where supposedly traditional Labour voters were, whether it was the North, the Midlands, and Wales, it seemed as if many of them, maybe these people are socialists. Maybe these people are, once upon a time would have voted for somebody like Tony Benn to be Prime Minister of Britain, or even leader of the Labour Party. But when I started to dig deeper into the politics of some on the left who supported Brexit, talk to them about trans issues, talk to them about immigration. And then you start to go, whoa, actually, no, these people, yes, they may be great on workers' right, but they're very much right-wing, right, left nationalists, whatever you want to call them, but they very much were, but they very much, harbored a lot of right-wing views, and were open to the idea of, corporatism and stuff like that. And that's where, of course, you got ridiculous arguments like the European Union is a neoliberal institution, and we can leave the European Union without a deal because then we can go to the World Trade Organization, to which I go, dude, if you think the European Union is too neoliberal, wait until you get a load of the World Trade Organization. So, and then the last thing I'll say, because I want your response on this, is you have many on the left who sort of don't want to acknowledge that we do live in a right-wing world, and that Donald Trump did become leader of his party, not because he actually cared about working class people, but because he explicitly said that he was going to deport a bunch of drug dealing Mexican rapists and stuff like that who brought nothing good to the US, and he was going to build a wall. That's what made him the Republican front runner overnight. Yes, he did say that he was going to take on corporations that would send jobs over to Mexico and China and stuff like that. But come on, the guy was a right-wing Molotov cocktail, and yet you still yet you still have you still had some on the left that kind of minimized that and thought that, well, if we just stop talking about identity politics, if we just, if we don't actually say that we defend immigrants, legal or otherwise, 100%, and just strictly talk to these Trump supporters about the class issue, we'll be able to convert them to our wonderful left policies. And so people got very pissed off when Hillary Clinton called Trump's supporters a basket of deplorables. And okay, in hindsight, maybe not a smart thing of her to say, but at the same time, like, come on, like, go to a Donald Trump rally and listen to the agenda he wants to advance. When he talks about too much wokeism, when he talks about too much political correctness, that's him basically, attacking, liberals, attacking the left, and again, it just seems as if we get in more trouble for calling out racism, xenophobia, transphobia, queerphobia. We get into more trouble for calling that out than the actual far right person in the form of a Bolsonaro, a Nigel Farage in the Brexit Party, Donald Trump, and so forth, or what we see across Eastern Europe with Viktor Orban, who I don't call them populists because that's really a complete misunderstanding of what populism was, and populism was a left-wing movement. But okay, fake populist, right, neo right-wing populist. If people want to use terms like that, okay, have at it. But it just seems to me as if, again, we get in more trouble for calling out racism than actually denouncing racism. I know people in Quebec have this problem all the time when it comes to calling out Quebec's institutional racism against immigrant people, against Indigenous people, against Black people, and so I did want to talk about so that's what I wanted to talk to you about. Sorry that I didn't articulate this in a proper question, but your response to a lot of the stuff I was saying, and a lot of the concerns and grievances that some on the Black left, Indigenous left, and others have when it comes to some of our white socialists and white Marxists who seem to be playing footsie with the far right and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, you said a lot, Youri. So there's so many times I thought I know what I want to respond to that, but I will have forgotten a lot of it by the time I get to it. But I agreed with a lot of what you said, and to key in on that piece in particular, where comrades are talking about white leftists who spend so much of their energy denouncing identity politics, denouncing wokeism, that they don't realize that they're essentially working as plants for the right. Complaining about wokeism, complaining about identity politics, complaining about liberalism is it's a right-wing critique, right? And that's not to say that there aren't left criticisms of liberalism that are accurate and fair. I mean, there are left criticisms of the way that identity politics gets mobilized to undermine solidarity, for instance. But when we as leftists make a principled argument about solidarity, solidarity includes recognizing racism, recognizing and confronting racism. That's part of what is solidarity. Solidarity isn't pretending race doesn't exist or pretending identity isn't there, pretending that homophobia doesn't exist or patriarchy, right? So when the left makes a criticism of identity politics, when we choose to get into that, the criticism, I think, ought to be very precise. It should be a criticism of the way that liberalism and liberal forms of identity politics undermine our ability to confront the real problem. So, for instance, if we were to criticize Hillary Clinton for the girl boss phenomena that she was a representation of, our criticism would be that there is a real and important feminist struggle that needs to happen. Mm-hmm. There are real material and ideological elements of sexism that are pervasive and harmful. They harm our capacity to build a better world together. And what Hillary Clinton does when she mobilizes liberal feminism is that she actively undermines our ability to identify and confront real sexism, real patriarchy. That's the left critique of identity politics. and it's important, it's valid. I think we need to choose our times and places when we engage in that critique, right? What I think has happened is that there are sections of the left, and you're right, it's especially on the white left, the male left, sections of the left that benefit the most from those other forms of oppression, who've sort of taken this like fight against identity politics as a kind of hobby horse, and it is an easy way to gain some followers who are people that might not always be of the left, might not be established people of the left, right? Those of us who are, decades into our, veteran status as leftists, we've been through all of this stuff a million times, and we've already figured out that sexism is real and homophobia is real, and we need to deal with these things. But someone who's new to a more critical kind of politics, might not be there yet and might well be receptive to, the wokes are out of control. For the left to engage with that, I think is doing the work of the right, because a person that you mobilize to left politics through the anti-woke or anti-identity appeal is a person who's eventually going to end up on the right. Like, if that's what appeals to them, if the way that you appeal to a person is by saying, aren't you sick of hearing about racism? Well, then, like, they're eventually going to end up the right-wing version of this, because there isn't really a left-wing version of it. There can't be a left-wing version of, I'm sick of talking about racism. That's just not left politics. Left politics is about confronting the oppressions that exist in our society, right? So yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right there, and the comrades that you were mentioning are right to be pointing this out. We have to, as the left, be really vigilant about the way we engage with far right stuff, and now more than ever. So there's a lot of other things to sort of say about all this, but I'll let you guide which pieces we go to.
Well, when it comes to Canada, and I think Canada, at least from what I've observed, from what I observed, going to a lot of left online events and being in touch with many people who are part of the anti-imperialist movements, the anti-racist, the anti-racism movement, abolitionist movements, even it seems to me as if at least the ones I know in Canada know how to chew gum and walk at the same time when it comes to the whole identity politics versus the class struggle thing. Certainly the people of the NDP Socialist Caucus, Socialist Action Canada know how to chew gum and walk at the same time. My friends in the Communist Party of Canada also, they don't. Yes, the Communist Party of Canada. At least the members I know also know how to chew gum and walk at the same time. But it seems as if in Britain and in Australia and in much of Europe, there seems to just be this super allergy of just not wanting to address racism, sexism, heteronormativity, and stuff like that. And of course,
I think Youri, if I may.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if I may, I might jump in there just to say, I don't think you're right. I disagree that there is something different happening in Canada. Okay. I think you find all the same strains. You find all of the same mixture of the left. There are certainly those of us here who, as you say, can walk and chew gum at the same time. But I also see within the Canadian left, and we have a very specific manifestation of it here. We, I think, discussed this the last time we were talking, because we were talking about the Freedom Convoy, which was a Canadian right-wing mobilization.
Exactly. That's definitely something that we kind of that's something.
And I saw a lot of Canadian leftists be pulled into and try to draw others into sort of supporting, some version of either supporting the convoy or let's infiltrate the convoy and bring people to the left, some version of that. And it was always imbued with precisely the kind of thing you're talking about, this anti-woke kind of thing. The woke is out of control. And, you know, we on the left have to acknowledge that too. That's how we're going to reach people, because normal people are sick of the wokeness. And so I would say, probably not surprising coming from me, I don't want to let Canada off the hook. I don't want to let Canadian leftists off the hook. All the same stuff you're describing is very present here too.
Exactly. No, that's actually it's actually a very good thing that you brought that up. Hopefully, YouTube doesn't censor this, since we are talking about the Freedom Convoy, which brings into the very thorny issue of COVID. Now, I'm not going to, now we're not going. Well, the whole coronavirus crisis. I mean, I don't want to get too much into it because I've been censored a couple of times for even pushing back against the whole anti-vax extremists. But I'll just say my 2 cents. I understand that there were a lot of people that were concerned about the safety of the vaccines and stuff, and stuff like that. I think those were very legitimate concerns. But that being said, if you do think that the vaccine was unsafe, then we need to go back into lockdowns. But if we are going to go back into lockdowns, we should be advocating for a very strong left policies and a left movement which makes sure that workers aren't thrown under the bus, that working class women and whatnot are not left to the wolves of capitalism when they lose their job because businesses have been hit hard by the pandemic and stuff like that. But it seemed to me as if so many people who were supporting the Freedom Convoy, and I did notice many left-leaning folks, I'm not going to name specific names or anything like that, but I did notice a lot of left-leaning people in both Canada, but largely in the U.S., saying that, like, hey, this was a working class movement. We should be supporting this. This was definitely a left populist movement, when it was so obvious that the Freedom Convoy was led by the far right people. And then to see certain YouTube leftist personalities, bringing, using Rebel Media or True North as a source that, like, hey, this really was a working class movement. Okay. And even if it was a bunch of working class people protesting, that doesn't mean that, like, the working class isn't capable of being bigoted or isn't capable of being seduced by far right cult leaders and stuff like that. So, yeah, and so I'm curious, your thoughts on that, because again, it was just very distressing to see left-leaning folks, people who are great at debunking Syria propaganda, people who are great at mobilizing anti-war sentiment and whatnot, put a false left-wing spin on what was clearly a far-right movement, and people attacking Justin Trudeau, not from the left, but people who were attacking him, attacking the Liberal Party from the far right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what has happened, and I was speaking with someone about this just last week, is that the left has abandoned a lot of important positions that it used to hold. For instance, the anti-war.
Actually, by the way, Tyler, sorry to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt. But the light is really shining. The sun is really shining on you. So
it is. While you were talking, I was trying to maneuver around a little bit. Let me see if I can find another angle, because I am feeling it myself. Let me see if maybe if I sort of slide over here a little bit.
It's a bit shiny there, but I think it's a little bit better.
Is it a little better? Let me. I'm burning up actually from it. Didn't expect it to be quite so sunny today. I don't know if this is any better. I think it's probably as best as we're going to get. But continue with what you were saying. I don't mind the interruption because I was really feeling it too. I think the left has abandoned positions that it held previously, and the anti-war position, in particular, it should be a left-wing movement fighting against imperialist war. The war in Ukraine and Russia is complicated. There's lots of factors at play, but fundamentally, anyone on the left, anyone who has been on the left long enough to watch the war on terror, to watch the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, and so on, should be well past being sucked into liberal narratives about these wars. This is an imperialist conflict. It is an inter-imperial rivalry that's playing out between the West and this bloc in Russia and China, and it is imperialist in its intervention. I mean, just look, who is harmed by this war? The people who are being harmed more than anyone else are working class people in Ukraine, be they ethnically Ukrainian or ethnically Russian. It is working class people who are being harmed by the perpetuation of this conflict. And it seems very clear that the West is interested in perpetuating the conflict, providing weapons to the Ukrainian army to maintain an ongoing conflict, but not enough to end it in one way or another. That is a position that the left has always held. I marched in 2003 against the war in Iraq, and it wasn't because I thought Saddam Hussein was good. It wasn't because I thought Saddam Hussein, should have our support. It was because I understood that no matter how bad Saddam Hussein was, nothing better would happen with a Western intervention.
Exactly.
And the left has always understood this. I think, you've mentioned Syria. I think that 2014-15 in Syria, the left really, really struggled with what to do about that conflict. My position was the same. To me, it had nothing to do with whether you thought Assad was good or bad. I have many reasons to think that Assad is very bad. A lot of people I cared about have been killed by Assad. But that didn't mean that an imperialist intervention by the West was going to make things better in Syria. And so, at that moment, I remained, a left anti-war. I maintained a left anti-war perspective. That's been lost between then and now. That capacity of the Western left to be anti-war in that way has dissolved. And so, flash forward to 2022 and the current war, and there is no.
And then on top of that, there was a point where the only people who were speaking out against the Syria war was libertarians. Rick Sterling, who's been on the program many times, he was even saying to me that the left actually should be working sometimes with libertarians if it comes to issues like ending the drug war and ending the war in Syria. So, and I think that's where, and I think with the Ukraine thing, I'm pretty sure if you read 5 left publications, they're all either stand with Ukraine, or they're all very much like rah, NATO's a force for good in the world. And then if you read publications like, I'm sure, anti-war, or you go to Ron Paul's Institute of Peace and Prosperity, they're going to explain to you why we should not be supporting who Joe Biden and Chrystia Freeland are supporting in Ukraine.
Right, but I would push back here a little bit. I don't know if it's a pushback or not, but I would want to clarify on this point. So, my position is that the left has abandoned this anti-war stance that it held for so long. And what that has done, and I think this is a bad thing, what that has done is it has opened up space for the right to claim it. And so it's true, you will find, never mind Ron Paul, I was on Twitter before our conversation, and there's a hockey player, just a dumbass hockey player, used to play for the Canucks, who's out there on Twitter picking fights with people because he doesn't want hockey players to have to wear pride jerseys. And I go to his page. Okay, so he's just your run-of-the-mill average, Western Canadian racist, homophobe, bigot. And I go to his Twitter page, and I'm looking through his likes to see what he's been up to, and he's been liking right-wing anti-war posts about Ukraine and Russia. Now, this really gives me pause, because it makes me say to myself, well, have I somehow found myself having common ground with a guy who is like an open bigot, a meathead that hates people who wear trans and pride, jerseys and tape? Do we agree on something? And we don't. We don't. I don't believe for an instant that Tom Sestito, formerly of the Vancouver Canucks, has a principled opposition to the war in Ukraine. What I think has happened is that the right has recognized an opening. They have recognized that there is a wedge with which they can hammer the liberal establishment, be it Trudeau and Freeland, or Biden and Harris, or any other of that sort of set of the liberal establishment, who have committed themselves to this conflict and to support for Ukraine. They have 100% put all of the chips in the middle for this conflict. And in many ways, I think it's self-evident to people that that's not necessarily good, and that this might be complicated. Every time a new video comes out about Ukrainian soldiers wearing Nazi regalia, every time Chrystia Freeland herself is photographed with Banderaite, flags and scarves and things, there is an opening for them to be criticized. Now, the left should be criticizing them for this. The left should be on that. We should be making the principled anti-war arguments that we have always made. We should be directly pointing out.
Well, of course.
Actually, if I may, I just want to finish this one thought and wrap it up, and then I hand it right back to you, Youri. But we need to be making those arguments from the left, making those criticisms from the left. By not doing that, we have allowed the right to do it. And I don't believe that the right is doing it in good faith. I don't believe for a second that the right genuinely is anti-war. When have they ever been? The right has never been anti-war as a principle. And I don't think that the right suddenly developed some kind of fine-grained understanding of the conflict in Russia and Ukraine, and has a humanitarian opposition to a war that hurts working people. I think the right has figured out that this is a thing they can use against the liberals. If the right were in power, I don't think they would have any problem engaging in imperialist war. They've never had any problem engaging in imperialist war in the past. So for me, and this is my sort of wrap this up moment, the right is tactically against the war. The left ought to be against the war in principle. And that's why the left shouldn't be tailing the right. That's why we shouldn't be working with right-wing movements as part of this. We should be building our own anti-war position. We should be building that up. So sorry to have cut you off, but I wanted to make sure I wrapped up that thought.
But that said, and yeah, it's funny in Europe because, it's not surprised that the traditional center left parties who've made their careers, supporting, NATO and whatnot, and making, Faustian pacts with, big business. But I mean, in France, for example, yes, Mélenchon, criticizes NATO and speaks out against France's imperialism, but a lot of the anti-war sentiment, or even it being articulated, is coming from the national, Marine Le Pen's, National Front, and the right-wing shock jock, Zemmour, who was horrendous on most issues. But when it came to the war in Ukraine, he was the only one that was making sense, saying, yeah, we provoked Putin to do this conflict. We shouldn't be getting involved in NATO and stuff like that. But so yes, and much of the left, which I think is almost of non-existent in Europe, since most of them are all gung ho for NATO and they want a war with China, even if they don't say that they want a war with China, they support containment, they support sanctions and stuff like that. So it's very distressing that once upon a time, World War I, Vietnam War, Second Iraq War. Those people could be mobilized in the streets, but now it's but now they support the destruction of Libya. They support wars against their own against left governments that they should be protecting, Syria and whatnot. But when it comes to what you said, that we should not be working with the right wing, even if they might be good on on Ukraine, or they might be good on ending the drug war. But what would you say though to but somebody like Max Blumenthal, and I'm not going to insult him. I'm just going to repeat the arguments I heard from him, Jimmy Dore and Aaron Matze. What would you say to somebody like Max Blumenthal, who says that, look, I don't agree with Tucker Carlson's views on immigration. I find that the anti-trans stuff is hideous, but we need to build a movement against these endless imperial wars, which is military. The military, that's the police on steroids. And if the libertarians are against, the CIA, against the deep state, perhaps if we do meetings with them, if we do anti-war demonstrations with them, we might be able to convert some of them to our leftist point of view. And the only because I don't mind an Aaron Mate or a Jimmy Dore or a Max Blumenthal going on Tucker Carlson's program if it's to talk about ending the war on Syria, why people should be why the whole anti-Russia conspiracy theories against Trump is BS. I'll only start to denounce them if they start to adopt right-wing positions, like what we saw with Tulsi Gabbard, who I once admired, who I thought was a good socialist performance at home, anti-imperialist abroad, but has now gone so far to the right in her end. And she explicitly said when she resigned from the Democratic Party that the Democratic Party is too much wokeism, they're too much against the police, blah, 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 all sorts of stupid shit like that. And then that's where I go, okay, if that's what going on Fox News to present an anti-war case is going to bring you, then I'm sorry, I don't want any part in that.
And it is. I think it is. I mean, I think we all could have watched Glenn Greenwald and learned from what happened with Glenn Greenwald. He used to be a good, solid left liberal reporter who did important work, and particularly around stuff in Brazil, I found him to be a really useful voice. And he got frustrated with the liberal establishment and the way that the liberal establishment didn't want to engage with certain elements of his left liberal critique. He found that the right was receptive because they too wanted to hammer liberals. And so he started playing along. And at first he justified it as like, well, no, I'm going to go on and I'll turn some people around. I'll go on Fox News and I'll trick them and I'll get Fox News supporters to become leftists. I don't think that's how it works. I don't think that a union of left and right ever ends with people coming out more left. A union of left and right almost always favors the right. And I said this. So that's interesting that you say that. So like my hero Ralph Nader, the reason why there's a part of me that still is open to this idea of left-right alliances is because of Ralph Nader, the late great Alexander Cockburn of Counterpunch. I can't read Counterpunch for many reasons now because they've gone so much to the right on issues like Syria, on Ukraine and stuff like that. Okay, but that aside, Alexander Cockburn, he was an advocate of working with the right, working with libertarians when it came to anti-war stuff, anti-CIA stuff, anti-drug wars. Ralph Nader has talked about how when it comes to the over-sexualization of the culture, when it comes to cigarette. Anyways, the long story short is that Ralph Nader did advocate that, and there was times where he felt certain campaigns, Christian conservatives who were concerned about their children being overly exposed to advertising and to the over sexualization of the culture, which I do think is a problem. I just don't want. Anyways, so your response to that, to what Cockburn did much of his life, and to what Ralph Nader articulated and apparently
sometimes it's been good. So what would you say to that?
Well, I mean, what I would say is there's a big difference between hosting a left-wing event that is against the war and saying that people from the right are invited to attend it and be part of it. If there's something in what we are doing that appeals to you on the right, hosting a left-wing discussion. I mean, a YouTube session like this, which is of the left. If you were to do that and invite someone of the right to watch and maybe even participate, if they are interested in what you're doing, that's an invitation to bring someone into a left-wing project. And I can understand that. I can understand the logic there. I mean, look, ultimately, we need to bring people to the left. And that is going to include bringing some people who have drifted to the right. But that's totally different from thinking that you can go into a right-wing space, thinking that you can move into politics that are already established as right-wing politics and somehow push it to the left. In my opinion, it's a profound misunderstanding of what the right is. And I don't know if we've had this particular conversation, Youri, but when I talk about what fascism is, at its core, what fascism is anti-communism. At its core, that is the central animating logic and emotional heart of fascism. Fascism is an ideology that wants to restore order to chaos. Fascism sees chaos and promises a restoration of order. That order is always some sort of mythologized past, where there was a hierarchical structure to life. Everyone knew their place and stayed within it, which is why, obviously, fascism is so racist and sexist and homophobic and so on. And that if we just get back to that mythologized, beautiful past, we can provide a better life for everyone. That's the sort of central premise of fascism. And their enemy is those who would create the chaos. And those who are creating the chaos are the left. Liberals as well, right? In different ways. They lump left and liberals together because in both cases, left and liberal are upsetting the traditional order of life. I don't think there is any way meaningfully for the left to be part of and to have alliances with, even alliances of convenience with, the politics of anti-communism. That just doesn't make sense to me. So when we imagine that we can somehow pull the right to our side, I think we're fooling ourselves in a way that history has proven otherwise. And I hate to invoke the history of Nazi Germany because it is sort of cliche to do so, but the reality is that there was a massive communist movement in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, and sections of it thought we should join with the Nazis. They may be nationalistic, they may have some, racialist views that we don't accept, but they are also tapping into a certain segment of the working class that we fail to reach. And we need to go in there and we need to work with them and tap into that section. And maybe an alliance between the left and this new Nazi organization will be enough to finally overthrow the Weimar Republic and recreate a socialist German state. And what did those people get? They got murdered. They made themselves part of the apparatus of Nazism, one of the most vicious and disgusting fascist regimes in history. And then they got killed because fascism had no interest ever in working with the left. Fascism was about destroying the left. So, I don't mean to suggest that like Max Blumenthal is about to get murdered, but I do mean to say that there is something incredibly dangerous, both for the broader public and also for us individually as leftists, in thinking we can have alliances with an ideology that at its core is about doing the exact opposite of what the left wants to do. You opened our discussion, I think, you said a lot of really great stuff about the way that some leftists are afraid of identity politics. They're afraid of talking about racism. They're afraid of talking about sexism. So how will it help the left to go into spaces that say there is no racism, there is no sexism, there is no homophobia, these people need to get over it? How would it help us in confronting those very real problems that you identified by building alliances with people who explicitly reject even having the discussion? I mean, we're not going to convince Tucker Carlson that he needs to be an anti-racist. That's never going to happen. And any energy that we put into trying to convince Tucker Carlson that he should be an anti-racist is time that we could otherwise have spent trying to find other people who have not been drawn to the right and pull them into a better kind of left politics.
Well, what would you say then to and again what would you say then again to somebody like Max Blumenthal, who when I was watching the Gray Zones program with Jimmy Dore, where they were denouncing where they were responding to their critics for having this big anti-war mobilization with lots of libertarians and the MAGA communists and the patriotic socialists and stuff like that. Now, Blumenthal brought up this interesting example because of course he's been involved with a lot of Palestine solidarity and so forth, and he brought up this story how when he first started to speak out against Zionism and had books written about the apartheid state of Israel, its hideous settler colonialism, he said that he would speak at mosques where the clerics were very socially conservative, very patriarchal, very heteronormative, and stuff like that. But when it came to that issue of Palestine, that was his audience, and he wasn't going to use that time to say to these conservative Muslims, hey, queer liberation and women's liberation and how and stuff like that. And so and basically, I think what Max was sort of getting at was that getting to know some of these people on a human to human level, you can create then a space where you can try to convert some of those people to actually being very feminist or more tolerant towards the LGBTQIA plus community. And I come from the continent of Africa, which is very socially conservative, very socially regressive when it comes to, again, very heteronormative, can be very, very patriarchal. You can blame that on imperialism and stuff like that, but look, it is there. The Middle East, I certainly wouldn't. Certainly, if I was a member of the LGBT community, I would not be showing affection to my partner while I'm in Lebanon or even Syria, and certainly, of course, not Saudi Arabia and Iran, which has theocracy in it, but we have to build a movement. And when we go and hypothetically, I assume if I was to be invited to a Middle Eastern school, or if you were invited to a Middle Eastern school, yeah, it's probably not the time where you're going to say
Right.
solidarity to our queer brothers and sisters, unless we were invited specifically by a people power movement there that says, okay, we need some advice. How can we advance queer liberation, women's liberation, whatnot? So I'm curious.
Here's how I would respond to that. I mean, it's a really good point, and I agree with you. But I think that's a very different thing from getting involved and working with far right, explicitly far right organizations. Okay, so the example you gave, you're going into say a mosque. To speak about Palestine, and what do you do about the social conservatism in the mosque? Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, right? And I think as thoughtful, principled leftists, you have to say, well, look, I mean, there's reasons that social conservatism has become deeply entrenched in Islam. Those reasons are, Islam could have gone in many different directions. In many ways, the conservative elements have come to the forefront because of the colonial baggage in so many Islamic countries. We have to understand that. We have to respect the fact that Islam and going back to Islam has been in part a refuge against Western colonialism. It's a place people, think about Algeria in the 1950s and 60s and the way that the French denigrated Islam. Islam then becomes part of the mechanism by which you defy colonialism. So there's history there that as thoughtful leftists, we can understand why Islam is the way it is, and understand that there is something to being respectful in the way we engage. And to understand that that doesn't necessarily mean that in every single way, every single person in a mosque has a committed right-wing politics. Mm-hmm. There's a thread there, right, that's going to be socially conservative in certain respects, but it's a thread that can be negotiated and renegotiated over time. It isn't hard-boiled in the same way that someone who explicitly identifies as being a member of the far right, joining far-right organizations, being a white supremacist, that's not a thread, right? That's a core politics. That's a core set of beliefs. So, I mean, I like everything you said. I understand, and I think we do need to be really sensitive to, we can't just do purity politics. We can't just go into every space. I mean, this is what the Trotskyists try to do, right? Is have a perfect purity kind of politics, a fully worked out position on every type of oppression, and anyone that can't live up to that doesn't belong. We shouldn't do that, right? We're not going to have anyone in our movement. We have to meet people where they're at. I'm a teacher, right? People come into my classrooms with all kinds of ideological baggage, and I don't kick people out the first time they say something I don't like. I work with them. I work through it with them, and I try to help people come to different perspectives. So I get that. But again, I really want to emphasize, I think there's something different when we're talking about, the organized far right has a movement. They're using particular talking points that seem to overlap with talking points that we might agree with, but their core politics is totally different. And right now, if we go to something like that march again, whatever they called it, the Rage Against the War Machine event, my position is that we would be amplifying a right-wing position. We'd be amplifying right-wing politics. What is needed is a left anti-war movement, a left anti-war Rage Against the War Machine, give it a different name so that we don't seem like we're tailing them, but a left-wing version of that. And then, look, if people from the right want to tail us, okay, you're welcome. And if there's something here that appeals to you, great. Maybe we can bring you on board. But we're not gonna have any success going to their events and trying to convince people who've already been convinced that trans people shouldn't exist, gay shouldn't be said out loud, and there's a natural order of races and white are at the top. There's no ground, for collaboration.
It's funny because it seems to me as if you can. It's because it seems to me as like, okay, if you think you can convert a libertarian or 3 or 4 or 5 to a left-wing cause by explaining to them that the free market is why we have these endless wars and stuff like that. It's not just about crony capitalism, it's about capitalism in general. Okay, if you want to do that, have at it, but then don't expect us, Black leftists, indigenous leftists, the Latinx leftists, and certainly not the queer, liberationist leftists, to then be a part of, that demonstration, which I think was why, Black Alliance for Peace, people like Jacqueline Luqman said, no, I'm sorry, I just cannot be a part of, of this one demonstration. But at the same but what was another example I could use to sort of push back against? It's very interesting, what you said. But I think about, when it comes to trying to convert, the right to our movement, I think of the fact that Tulsi Gabbard before she went completely batshit right wing, and I do denounce her for that, and I owe an apology to Robbie Martin, and Mike Preisner when they said to people Tulsi Gabbard was a grifter, and they warned people about right wing skeletons in her closet. So, you know, so I owe them. So I do owe them, you know, an apology. But at the same time, Tulsi Gabbard, I know when Michael Tracy was covering her campaign when she wanted the Democratic nomination, she was able to convert a lot of libertarians into a socialist reformist ideology and not their market fundamentalism, because many libertarians were attracted to her anti-imperialism. And then I think of Bernie Sanders when he first ran for office, and he went to Liberty University, Jerry Falwell's Christian fundamentalist university, and Bernie went there, spoke to a largely Christian right audience, and said to them straight up, "I'm for abortion. I completely disagree with your views on gay marriage and gay rights, but let me talk to you about the class system." And then, of course, he started to denounce, you know, the oligarchy that is America. Brought up examples of, you know, Jesus railing against rich people, stuff like that, and managed to convince a largely right-wing audience. He got a lot of them standing up and, you know, and applauding him, and even you know, left the place very amicably when Jerry Falwell Jr., you know, gave him prayer and wished him the best of luck in his campaign. So
yeah, and Bernie's a
so the Ralph Naders of the world, the Max Blumenthal's of the world, and the Jimmy Dore's of the world would say that's proof that we have to engage with the right, and if we do make alliances, we can be able to convert them to our stuff. And if the item of the day is marching against the Ukraine war, marching against war on China, isn't this a win for our movement?
I mean, Bernie's a good example because, you know, I think Bernie actually is very good at doing that sort of thing. He is very good at going into right-wing spaces and staying principled, you know, not tailing the right, staying principled, speaking to people, you know, about issues that are real. You know, he goes on a Fox News, you know, live cast and talks about healthcare with people, and earned a standing ovation that time too. Goes on Joe Rogan's show and speaks plainly and clearly about, you know, left liberal politics. And
example.
Bernie,
yeah, that's a great example. Yeah,
Bernie did a really good job of that. Bernie did not change or slow the momentum of the growth of the far right in America. In fact, the far right has continued to grow. The far right is growing still. So I'm not sure that when we look back on those things, we're going to think, oh, that was good work. I think we might look back on some of those things and think, you know, that didn't really work. It actually kind of backfired. It certainly taught the right that if they speak more clearly on class issues, they will reach people, because there is an underlying truth, fundamental truth. And all Marxists would, I think, agree that there is a fundamental reality, you know, that faces working class people, the realities of exploitation. You know, even the advantages of a settler white working class can't completely stop the reality of class exploitation. You can speak about class exploitation and it's going to resonate for people. If you do it right, it's going to resonate. But I don't think that engaging with the right in doing so and showing the right that they can use those things to their advantage is strategically wise. I think we need to be doing all of the things that we do explicitly and clearly from the right. And, you know, you've mentioned Tulsi Gabbard, Glenn Greenwald, the list of examples of people who started out with this whole, I'm going to work with the left and right. It's not about left and right. It's about, you know, truth and fiction, or, you know, whatever they say when they say that it's not about left and right. It's always about left and right. It is always about left and right. That is the fundamental contradiction in the society in which we live. Either you want to change society to make it more equal, more just, more fair, less hierarchical, or you want to maintain those hierarchies and reinforce them and reinscribe them. Those are the only two poles of political ideology. And I think that we get lost if we try to pick and choose and cherry pick. Well, on this issue, right now, we agree about the war in Ukraine, so why don't we work together? I don't think that's strategically wise, and I think that over time, Youri, what'll happen is that a lot of the people that you might be thinking about right now, Jimmy Dore, maybe Max Blumenthal, 10 years from now, I wonder if you'll have to issue an apology for backing them, because I wonder if they will be the next Tulsi Gabbards. I don't know Jimmy Dore. I don't really care. I've never really made much of an effort to know who he is, but from the bits and pieces that I've got, I feel pretty confident. Maybe you should screen grab this and save it, set it aside. One day, Jimmy Dore will just be on the right. And I think that's true of a lot of leftists who try to engage in this left-right unity stuff. I think it usually ends up with them just being on the right.
It's funny. It's so interesting, what you're saying, because it sounds to me as if, people, I understand that there's a lot of anger I understand that there's a lot of anger. There's a lot of anger about the inequality. There's a lot of anger about these endless, unjust wars. You try to mobilize against, the pivot to Asia. You try to mobilize against the Syria war, and your own people, attack you viciously, smear you viciously, or deplatform you. It was shocking what happened to past guest Rania Khalek, when I followed the intense smear campaign that was launched against her, and it was not coming from corporate media or from the Fox News of the world or the CNNs and the New York Times. It was coming from independent left-leaning media and the Al Jazeeras of the world, of course, funded by the Qatari states, which is why they supported the war in Syria. So they're selectively war, not consistently anti-war. But anyways, I think when you see stuff like that, and when you see, the vicious smear campaign that Max Blumenthal was subjected to when it came to debunking the war on Syria, the anti-Russia conspiracy theories, and of course, I give Jimmy Dore nothing but credit for holding Bernie Sanders, the AOCs of the world, into account for their warmongering, for making Faustian pacts with Joe Biden and stuff like that. But at the same time, with all of this anger that people have, and I understand, people who are angry about, identity politics being co-opted by, the Obamas of the world, the Trudeaus of the world, the Tony Blairs of the world. I understand that people are angry when something like feminism, something like, gay, LGBTQIA plus rights and so forth get weaponized, and those movements get co-opted by, the Democratic Party, the rival oligarchic party. It could be the Liberal Party, Labor Party. So I understand where people are coming from. I myself was attacked I was attacked in my own family, in my own society, for warning people that Obama was, a wolf in sheep's clothing, called a self-hating black man and stuff like that. But that being said, I never ever, throughout all of that, decided to become more and more tolerant of the right. Yes, I understand that. Yes, I do agree with Donald Trump when he says that we should be having détente with Russia. The National Front in France, some of their arguments why we shouldn't have immigration when we already have so many poor people. Okay, that's an interesting argument. But at the same time, again, Trump didn't. Yes, Donald Trump had the white working class support because he said that he was going to go after corporations who send their jobs over to Mexico and China where they use such cheap labor, and he said he was going to tax them, blah, 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 hit them with the tariff. Okay. But in the end of the day, he really became the right-wing rock star he was because he explicitly said that he was basically going to beat the shit out of illegal, Latinx immigrants and stuff like that. And they
can be right for the wrong reasons. right?
Exactly.
People can get things right for the wrong reasons. And I say this in my book about Canada. I mean, Canada ends up joining. We talked last time about Canada's support for fascism in the 1930s, 20s, and 30s. Canada ends up fighting against fascism. Canada ends up on the right side of World War II. But my point about that, and it's a tough thing, it's a tough point to articulate, and you really have to work people through it. But my point there is that Canada got it right, but for the wrong reasons. Canada eventually fights against Hitler, but only out of concern that Hitler's empire is going to, marginalize the British Empire. Canada wasn't fighting against Hitler for the right reasons. Now, if it's 1942, does that mean you don't join the fight against Nazism? No, you join the fight against Nazism, but you do so not under the flag of Canada, which is doing it for the wrong reasons. You do it because you're an anti-fascist, right? Because before the war, you would have been opposed to Canada's position because they weren't doing enough about fascism. After the war, you'd have to be mad at Canada again because they weren't doing enough about fascism. They put the same fascists back in power in West Germany that they had just defeated. So if you got fooled in 1942 into thinking Canada was right, Canada was good because they're fighting against fascism, then you missed the big picture, right? Because Canada was right in that moment, but for the wrong reasons. And I think you've described it really well. I mean, that's Trump when he occasionally got it right about Russia for the wrong reasons, right? And that's all of these different right-wing, movements that occasionally will tap into something correct. Sure, it's true. Brexit and the Brexit discussions, right?
I was just going to mention because sorry to interrupt, but
No.
I was a reporter for Black Agenda Reports when it was Jeremy Corbyn's last time being leader of the Labour Party, and I was covering him at the Labour Party's conference in Brighton, and I got a first-hand seat into how wrong-headed pushing a second referendum was, and the civil war that was going on between Jewish anti-Zionists and Jewish ultra-Zionists and stuff like that. But that being said, because I spent a great deal of time trying to understand, the left criticisms of the European Union, and for a period of time, I was very much of the favor that, if Britain leaves the European Union, it's going, it's going to be fantastic. All Jeremy Corbyn has to do is just articulate that Lexit argument that Tony Benn and so forth have. But that being said, we also have to come to realize that that while the European Union is bad for Eastern Europe, and it's bad for Greece and Spain and Portugal and so forth, and if they want to leave the European Union tomorrow, hey, as long as they have a very powerful left movement, you can take that leap of faith. But in Britain, saw benefits of the European Union, and the reason why they didn't get the full benefits was because the British state is a very reactionary capitalist state, and it still is, an empire in spite of what people say, and again, to see so many people on the left who were so determined to leave the European Union despite the horrendous stuff that was going to happen to immigrants, despite the fact that it was only going to empower more racism, more xenophobia, and the fact that it was the far right that was in control over the messaging, the Boris Johnsons of the world, the Nigel Farages of the world, the big Murdoch papers, the Daily Mail, and stuff like that. That in the end of the day, although I thought a second referendum was stupid, but in the end of the day, the EU left reformists, the Anders Varoufakis of the world, Caroline Lucas of the Green Party, in the end of the day, they were right to warn people that voting to leave Brexit was only going to create more of a downward spiral. And again, we see so many of those supposedly leftist people who supported leaving the European Union either abstained voting for Jeremy Corbyn, or voted for Boris Johnson, or voted for the Brexit Party. A lot of their politics has become nothing but reactionary because all they're talking about is there's too much wokeism.
Exactly.
When there was the big Black Lives Matter protests and people talking about institutional racism in England, these guys are spending most of their times, racially harassing Meghan Markle and denouncing the Black Lives Matter protests and them tearing down statues of slave owners because they said, how dare these people want to tear down statues of Winston Churchill? Where are these people's patriotism? The blue labor folks. And of course, there's now versions of that coming out in the U.S. with this whole ridiculous notion of patriotic socialism or MAGA communism. And again,
but that's exactly it. You're exactly onto it. I think that's exactly the point, right? That this is a growing trend, that this is an increase. There is more of this now. This, quite rightly, you put it, ridiculous patriotic socialism and MAGA communism. And I think you're right. You're identifying exactly the thing, which is that, there can be moments where a specific position will overlap. The left position, and the far right position will be the same, usually because it's in disagreement with neoliberalism, right? Neoliberalism is doing a thing, right? We all hate billionaires. Yes, we all hate billionaires. Fuck Bill Gates. Fuck Elon Musk. Fuck George Soros, right? Fuck all the billionaires. We on the left know exactly why we hate billionaires. There is a growing section of the right that also hates billionaires, but they hate them for the wrong reasons. They hate them because they think they're Jewish banker conspirators who are pulling the strings of a conspiratorial WEF that's going to force everyone to do environmentalism in 15-minute cities and drag shows for kids, right? These are totally different ways of getting to I hate billionaires. And as much as it would be satisfying to take the shortcut of saying, hey, look, we all agree we hate billionaires,
and
right?
they also think that the European Union and George Soros of the world are forcing cultural Marxism on them.
Yeah.
So gay people, women people, they're all getting special treatments from the George Soros NGO world. So, yeah.
Exactly. Right. So, I mean, I think that fact that you can hold the same position, but from extremely different places, like that's what we have to remember in all of these discussions. And I think we really do have to be principled. I said to someone last week, the right has a certain advantage tactically over us, which is that they don't have principles, not in the way that we do. They don't care about their principles in the way that we do. We on the left are obsessed with our principles to a fault, sometimes too much. I think some of the things that you've been sort of pushing against, some versions of the left that I can feel you pushing against, are precisely those elements of the left that are just absolutely refusing to budge on any aspect of their principles, right? I won't speak in a mosque because, there's patriarchy there. And I think it's too much so that way on the left at times.
Too. Yeah.
Well, yeah, absolutely, right. But I think that it is also what makes us the left. What makes us the left is precisely that we think all of these things are important. It's precisely the fact that we're not willing to say, well, you know what? Disability, who cares? Well, it's just one problem. I got a million problems. Now you want me to worry about people with disabilities? Come on. We don't say that. That's not a left position, or it's not supposed to be a left position. And principled leftists wouldn't say that. Principled leftists would say, oh shit, we missed something here. There's a problem about accessibility. There's a problem about disability. We didn't notice it. We have to address it because we are driven by principles. The right is not driven by those same principles. The right will tactically say whatever they want, whatever they need to build their movement. And they are tactically right now saying that they're against the war in Ukraine. I am also against the war in Ukraine, but I'm against it for totally different reasons. And I know the danger of being part of that. In fact, it's made me be much more careful in the last year about how I make my criticisms of the war in Ukraine, because the last thing I want is to be taken up by the right and used as part of the right's process of building its movement, right? My project is different. Does that make sense?
But four quick things though before before we draw this conversation to the close. Then is I live in Belgium, and I follow mostly Eastern European Eastern European affairs. I'm often invited to speak on the barricade which is a pan Eastern European left-wing news outlets that covers Eastern European affairs from a critical left perspective. And I sometimes find myself in in disagreements with the two editors who are friends of mine, Boyan Sanzlaski and Dr. Maria Chernat. They mostly, when it comes to how we advance the left, they are not fans of the whole identity politics stuff, and think that, and because they're in Eastern Europe, Boyan is Bulgarian, based in Poland. Maria Chernat is based in Romania, and this is where the far right, that network of the far right that Richard Sanders exposed in his brilliant investigative historical series about who these well-funded Eastern European expat communities are who lionize Stepan Bandera and so forth like that. These were all a bunch of wolves in sheep's clothing. So that's what Eastern Europe has to deal with, and they are in the grips of not just one far right, but competing far rights, competing libertarians, and so forth. So Boyan and Maria, they are of the position that in order to advance the left, it needs, we have to be talking about the class issue. Class is what's going to unite most people, and the social conservatism is so dominant in the culture that you're simply not going to win if you explicitly say things like, we're going to have gender neutral bathrooms, we're going to give full rights to the Roma people, to immigrants and stuff like that, and of course going out of their way to have like the best feminist agenda. So what do you say? And I hope when they watch this, I hope I'm not mischaracterizing them, but that's just how I interpret it as as a person of color who has heard an element of that argument. What would you what would you say to folks like that who are living in far right places like in Alberta? Thomas Frank, who's been on the show, Kansas. What's the matter with Kansas? And so what do you say to those people who live in these far right universe where they think that, like, hey, I want liberation for all marginalized people, but in order to do that, I do have to be a bit tactical in how I do it and try to first win people over with the class thing, since that is, supposedly, gender neutral, color neutral, sexual orientation neutral.
Right, and we know the limitations of that argument, you and I. But I understand what you mean. I think what I would say is, again, if we're talking about explicitly left movements choosing how to prioritize different issues, choosing how to frame certain issues based on the objective conditions, or I guess the subjective conditions of the place where they're organizing. I mean, at some level, I'm going to defer to people who know their own context better than I do, right? I mean, I think it's a fine line. I think you have to be very careful. It's always going to be easier to appeal to racism rather than confront it, appeal to sexism rather than confront it. That's always going to be an easier path. That doesn't make it the right path. But sure, I'm willing to say, like, maybe there's a context to what it is to do left organizing in a place like Ukraine in the last 8 years, which has been increasingly dominated by fascist politics. How do you proceed as the left in Ukraine in those conditions? I'm not in a position to tell Ukrainian leftists how they should proceed. To the extent that I become aware and engaged in the left movements in different places, then I can start to have a position. I remember when I was working in Honduras a lot, and I was paying attention to the splits in the Honduran left and the different positions that were playing out on the Honduran left. And there were other international leftists who wanted to always push the most, the position that checked all the boxes for Western leftists. Okay, this is the anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic position. I struggled with that because I knew that reflected like 8 people in Honduras. That wasn't a section of the Honduran left that was having much of an impact.
Yeah.
And from the outside, my thought was, look, the left is trying to sort itself out, in a context of many years of defeats and reorganizations. And I'm going to just
much of that due
sorry.
To I was just going to add much of that due to imperialism, which the left has failed. The Western left has
exactly.
All forms of
exactly. And so for me, like, it's up to the Honduran left to figure out how they're going to sort those problems out, right? And I support the Honduran left broadly, and to a certain extent, as I became more involved, there were certain positions within it that I would say, well, I think this is the position I would most, be drawn to. But I also respect a certain degree of autonomy in that kind of a context, right? And I can't necessarily sit over here and dictate to some other section of the left how they need to proceed. I know what I think is best here in this context, and this is the context in which I can operate.
So it sounds to me as if, and I actually, was talking about this with, I was actually talking about this with Maria, both on the air and on the air, about how we can advance, the Eastern European left without throwing, feminists, queer liberationists, Roma people under the bus. But it sounds to me as if, whatever left movement does develop in Eastern Europe, it has to be Eastern European. It has to be socialism with Eastern European characteristics, just like the Chinese. Whether one thinks it's a socialist system or a capitalist system, but the Chinese say that their socialism, which they're building, is socialism with Chinese characteristics. So in the Middle East, and I'm always going to say this to my Middle Eastern comrades, the Middle East, the only way the Middle East is going to really, advance when it comes to the left and vanquishing imperialism is if you have a pan-Middle Easternist project, not a pan-Arab project which marginalizes Kurds, or a pan-Islamic project which marginalizes Christians, Jewish people, and by default is eventually going to be sectarian against Shia Muslims and stuff like that. But whatever kind of queer liberation politics or feminist project is going to develop in a Middle Eastern country, whether it's Lebanon or Syria or Afghanistan, if the far left ever makes a comeback, in similar in similar places like that, is that their queer liberation is not going to be like the Western one. Their feminism is not going to be like the Western one. Their feminism, women are still going to wear, the headscarf, and you still will have devout people go to their mosque, even if it's even though it's a secular society and whatnot. So
I want to jump in. Yeah, I jump in there. Just you mentioned Afghanistan, so I think there's something useful we can take by looking at Afghanistan in the sense that there is a left, there is a far left. The Shola Javid is still active. There's still a presence in Afghanistan, and they participated in the counterinsurgency against the Western occupation. But they had a complicated thing to sort out, which was that they were also the Taliban was also fighting a counterinsurgency war against the occupation. So what is the Afghan left supposed to do in a context where they have a very clear common enemy, which is the Western occupation, and yet radically different right and left politics? I can't tell you exactly, at every moment what decision was made, but I know that Shola Javid was grappling with that problem. And I also know that they did not get folded into or become part of the Taliban, which suggests to me that they maintained a certain integrity of their position. And I think that's what we need to keep focused on. I think ultimately what we as the left need to do is make sure that we continue to build left projects. And yeah, they're going to be different. Different places are going to have different left projects, and that's fine. And different left projects at different times are going to, make strategic choices to look past certain problems, whether it be about gender or about sexuality or what have you. And that's going to be up to each leftist organization to decide. Sometimes I'll agree and sometimes I won't agree. But that's different. And I think we need to distinguish between making selective, strategic decisions to kind of set aside some of our principles versus getting involved in and boosting right-wing politics. That's a line that I can't cross. I'm willing to support left movements that fall short in certain aspects, perhaps because I have more to learn. Like maybe I'm wrong, maybe they're onto something that I'm not, or maybe they're doing their own struggle. They're at a different place in their struggle. I mean, God knows the Canadian left is way behind on most things. So, right. So, I don't say any of this from the standpoint of like, oh, somehow the Canadian left has it figured out. No, we've got a lot. We're backwards on a lot of things. But there's a difference between being a left-wing movement that's struggling to parse out its line, struggling to figure out, well, why do we have this overlap with the right? Can we be a revolutionary communist, but also Muslim? Can those things coexist? Can liberation theology, Christian liberation theology work? I mean, there's a complicated set of questions, right? There's a ton of complicated questions that the left and different lefts have to answer and figure out. But the one thing that we absolutely know for a fact is that there is no unity to be had with the ideology that wants to destroy us. And the right is the ideology that most wants to destroy us. The liberals wouldn't mind destroying us, but they're also happy to just marginalize and tokenize us. But the right absolutely wants to destroy us and will at first opportunity. They are. The American far right and Canadian far right are actively attacking people on the left. I mean, they go to street brawls and try to kill people in Antifa. They mow people down at BLM protests with their cars. I mean, they're actively trying to kill people on the left, and they will continue to do so. So I don't think any union there can ever work, not under the banner of the right. And I know I've said this a couple times, I'm repeating myself, I don't mean to, but I think that's kind of ultimately where I fall on all of this.
Interesting, and then sort of two final things is I wonder how can the left how does the left and I still identify as being very much economically far left and whatnot, but when it comes to social issues I'm still very socially liberal when it comes to the rights to divorce, queer liberation, women's liberation, and whatnot, and very strong, indigenous liberation. But I'm wondering when it comes to issues like sex work, when it comes to issues like pornography, when it comes to issues like too much violence in our media, rap music and rock music and metal music accused of glorifying violent masculinity. How do we address those issues without empowering the far right, in which their censorship, it doesn't end there. It goes with them eradicating the left and eradicating just principled views like secularism, like women allowed to reproductive freedom, the rights of work, and queer people allowed to love whoever they want without the marginalization.
I mean, I think it's the same. I think I come to the same place with this, right? Which is these are struggles that have to happen internal to the left on all of these questions, and clearly, I think we have to have them. We have to have those struggles. We have to hash them out. I mean, one thing, you mentioned the Canadian left. You kind of praised the Canadian left earlier, and I jumped in to to qualify it a little bit, in part because one thing that's happened in the last couple decades in the Canadian left is repeated sex scandals, the repeated incidents of sexual harassment, sexual violence by members of Canadian left organizations. And then the organization tries to cover it up, or they blame the victim, or any number of bad reactions. And, the Canadian left has really been in a rough state as a result of that. This is unavoidable. These struggles have to happen. They have to happen on the left as much as anywhere, just as they have to happen in society. They have to happen within the left, and we can't take shortcuts and we can't avoid them.
Yeah.
And that can sometimes mean that it puts us in a weaker overall position. I mean, the Canadian left is weaker because at this moment, we really lack any, large organized communist or socialist party that is meaningful. And that's not good. That's a bad thing.
That's but what I sort of wanted to talk about was how do we, when it comes to our social liberalism, how do we confront, violence, too much violence in our media, and whether it's heavy metal or punk music which glorifies violence, and there's violence in a mosh pit, or when it comes to the over sexualization of women. I mean, it's bad. It's one thing that there's this underground thing, or to an extent, it's out in the open pornography. But to see so much soft pornography, like in our music videos and our pop EDM singers being just way too overly sexualized, in my opinion. I'm wondering, how do we address that without empowering the far right, which are the ones that scream about this, because you're of the opinion that we should not be playing footsie and making and having this left-right alliance, which has been the bulk of our conversations. But then when it comes to issues like pornography, sex work, and the over-sexualization in our culture, and even the the excessive amount of violence that's in our pop culture, how do we address that without, again, empowering, the Reagans of the world and those social conservative social?
I mean, we have to do it really thoughtfully. We have to do it really carefully and thoughtfully. I think that's the only real answer I can give, is that we have to be very conscious. I mean, you framed it the right way, and I don't necessarily agree with the specific problems you've identified. To a certain extent I do, and to a certain extent I don't. But when any of these issues are at play, I think you framed it the right way by saying we want to address this thing, but we don't want to empower the reactionaries who would do something very, very harmful with it. And if the position that we're taking within the left seems like it might be one that the reactionaries would jump on, then we need to be really thoughtful and careful about how we do that. Ultimately, I think, to come back to the question that you sort of opened with, that I think was an important one, how do we deal with these kinds of things without amplifying the right? How do we manage those things? And I don't think there's an easy answer. I don't think there is an easy path to that, except to say that we have to make sure that our own house is clean, in the sense that we are working through the problems. We are, engaging in good faith with one another on the left about trying to solve those types of things, and to try to come to lines that we accept, come to a line about the war in Ukraine that is solid, that takes, a lot of things into account, and which then the right might agree with it, but the right isn't leading the discussion. If there's an anti-war position to be had on Ukraine, the left is leading that discussion. And the right can join it if they want, if they think that it'll help them, but it's our position. And if they want to be a part of it, they have to join our anti-war position. We failed on that, because as of this moment in 2023, March 2023, the anti-war position, at least in North America, is a right-wing position. We've given it to them. We've let them have it.
And that position is what? In that position?
The anti-war position about Ukraine and Russia, specifically. The specific anti-war position about that war is it is dominated by the right at this moment, and it shouldn't be. It should have been a left-wing position, and it should be associated with left-wing politics. So I think we failed there, and we've given them a bit of a gift, right? And given up something that was important, an important part of left politics. I don't know if that answers the question you asked.
Well, as I always say, this will be the first of many conversations.
Yes.
And I think, and yes, and I think no, and I'm certainly in the future. I actually am going to be having my colleague from Romania, Dr. Maria Chinat, talk about the over sexualization of our culture and how we deal with that without having all the baggage that comes with the right wingism, because it is only the right wing that is really talking about stuff like that. But I think sort of in closing, a lot of times when white socialists, mostly white cisgenders, socialists, and heck, maybe even some of the females too, a lot of the times, when they say, why can't there be more solidarity? Why can't the left be more unified? I would say to the, I would actually have them sometimes ask that question themselves and think, okay, why do we have a black left movement? Or why do we have a feminist movement? Or why do we have a queer liberationist movement? And I think the reason why we have all these separate movements is because a lot of times those people, and heck, even in my own community, there's a lot of sexism and a lot of heteronormativity views, and as long as that continues, and whatever left bloc doesn't confront those issues and says that we do need to do much better. Just because we have workers' rights doesn't mean that eliminates racism, sexism, and heteronormativity. So I would basically, no, they should be asking that question and then really looking at, okay, was I really there for those marginalized groups when they really needed solidarity? In the end of the day, that is why we have a separate black left, a separate Latinx left, and why we've had, unfortunately, and I don't just denounce the white socialists, I denounce all of the different people power movements in the U.S. when it comes to the plight of Native Americans, in which I think all of the left, eco-socialists, feminists, workers' rights, immigrant rights have failed, and mostly not done the urgent solidarity which the indigenous people of America deserve. So,
and I would add too that solidarity, I mean, it's cliche, but that solidarity makes us all stronger. So that
exactly.
the class reductionist argument is self-defeating. In addition to being, I think, often ends up being racist and sexist too, but it's also self-defeating, because that kind of class reductionism limits our ability to be in solidarity with one another. And it's precisely solidarity that is our strength, right? I mean, it's, we don't have the same resources of the bourgeoisie, but what we have is the numbers. And our capacity for solidarity is what actually gives us political and economic strength. To fail on those things, as we so consistently have, ends up being self-defeating. It's shooting ourselves in the foot too. So there's even strategic reasons to be addressing these things properly. My last thought on not addressing those things properly on the left gives the right yet another way to poach people from our movements, because the right is not above pretending they suddenly briefly care about racism if they think they can use it to hammer some liberals and hammer some leftists. They're not above briefly pretending that they care about sexism if they think they can use it against. I saw it. I watched it. I've seen it play out in many instances, right? So, there is urgency to sorting out our internal shit as the left, but doing so in ways that maintain principled leftist positions on things and do not open us up to the possibility of collaborating with the right. I think a stronger left wouldn't be tempted to collaborate with the right. I think the the desire or the sort of temptation to collaborate with the right comes out of weakness. It comes out of the fact that we know we're weak and we're grasping and we're trying to find ways of growing, and that seems to be a shortcut. But unfortunately, I think it's an extraordinarily dangerous and short-sighted one, and I hope that I hope we won't make that mistake.
Well, it's a topic that it's a topic that I'll explore. I think probably many times with other guests. But on this, but I think that's probably a very good place to end. And one can only hope that that the and I say this to the mostly white Marxists and socialists. I just hope that they get their shit together. And for those for those in Africa and Eastern Europe, I mean, in the end of the day, they have to develop their left in their own unique way. But I just hope that they also don't throw people under the bus, because what's the point of being a left if you're still going to be conserving heteronormativity, sexism, and whatnot. But we're going to close. But we're going to close it there. So we're going to close it there. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Tyler Shipley, again a historian, always with a critical left perspective, and yes, and Tyler is professor of culture, society, and commerce at the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Humber College Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning. He's the author of Ottawa and Empire, Canada and the Military Coup in Honduras, and Canada in the World, Settler Capitalism and the Colonial Imagination. And again, Tyler, thank you so much for this conversation. This is an important conversation to have. And again, thank you so much for this. And I'm wishing you a great weekend. And I'm looking forward to having you back on to discuss more of these topics, which unfortunately even the best of the Canadian left is not having, right?
Absolutely. Thanks, Youri. I'll be glad to come back anytime.